December 20th, 1943, dawned cold and merciless over the frozen landscape of northern Germany. The sky, a canvas of slate-gray clouds, bore witness to one of the most brutal years in human history. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown gripped the controls of his B-17 bomber, Ye Olde Pub, as it limped through hostile airspace, trailing smoke and leaving a death signature across the winter sky. His crew of 9 men had just survived a bombing run over Bremen, but their ordeal was far from over. The aircraft had been savaged by German flak and Messerschmitt fighters, leaving it riddled with holes, one engine dead, another sputtering, and the tail section shredded beyond recognition. Behind him, the compartments told stories of desperation. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, lay unconscious in his shattered position, blood freezing against metal. The radio operator had been wounded, the oxygen system destroyed, and several crew members were drifting in and out of consciousness from lack of oxygen at 27,000 feet. Brown had dropped the bomber to a dangerous low altitude, skimming just above the German countryside at less than 1,000 feet, hoping to evade radar detection and find salvation in the fog banks rolling across the land. Every moment in the air was borrowed time. Every second they remained over enemy territory increased the probability of a fiery death. Then, cutting through the cloud cover like a predator sensing wounded prey, came the roar of a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The fighter's distinctive silhouette materialized off the bomber's right wing, close enough that Brown could see the pilot's face behind the canopy glass. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the final chapter of their story, written in smoke and flame. The Luftwaffe pilot had them completely helpless. Ye Olde Pub couldn't maneuver, couldn't defend itself, couldn't escape. The ball turret gunner was out of ammunition. The top turret was jammed. They were sitting ducks, waiting for the inevitable burst of 20mm cannon fire that would tear them apart. The German pilot was Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, a seasoned ace with 27 confirmed kills, just one victory away from earning the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest military honors. According to accounts documented in the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos and Larry Alexander, published in 2012, Stiegler had already proven himself as one of the Luftwaffe's most capable fighter pilots. He had flown in North Africa, in Sicily, and now defended the fatherland's skies against the relentless Allied bombing campaign. On this day, he had been refueling and rearming at Jever Airfield when he spotted the crippled bomber struggling across the German landscape. This should have been his easiest kill, a defenseless enemy aircraft barely airborne with no fighter escort in sight. Stiegler maneuvered his fighter closer, positioning himself for the kill shot. His thumb hovered over the firing button on his control stick. Through his gun sight, he could see the enormous holes in the bomber's fuselage, the missing sections of tail, the exposed crew members desperately trying to tend their wounded. Something gnawed at him, something beyond tactical considerations, beyond the mathematics of aerial combat. Franz Stiegler had learned to fly in a different era, when aviation was as much about honor as it was about killing. His instructor, Lieutenant Gustav Rodel, had once told him something that echoed through his mind at this critical moment. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. These words, spoken years earlier in the dusty airfields of North Africa, carried weight that transcended national loyalty or military orders. Stiegler circled the dying bomber, his Messerschmitt's powerful Daimler-Benz engine purring smoothly in contrast to the struggling American aircraft. As he pulled alongside the B-17's left wing, close enough to see into the shattered cockpit, Stiegler's war-hardened heart confronted an impossible decision. Inside the bomber, he could see Brown desperately fighting to keep the aircraft level. Behind Brown, through the massive holes in the fuselage, wounded crew members moved about in what appeared to be organized chaos. One man was rendering first aid to another. Someone else was throwing out equipment to lighten the load. These weren't abstract enemies or simple targets. They were men fighting to survive, just as Stiegler had fought to survive countless times over the Mediterranean and the English Channel. The German pilot had been in combat since 1940, flying through the crucible of the Battle of Britain, the scorching deserts of North Africa, where he served under the legendary Hans-Joachim Marseille, and the brutal skies over Sicily. He had seen friends incinerated in their cockpits, watched parachuting pilots machine-gunned by vengeful enemies, and witnessed the gradual degradation of warfare's ancient codes. But Stigler had been raised in a Catholic household in Regensburg, Bavaria, where concepts like mercy and honor were not merely abstract principles, but fundamental truths. His father, also a pilot in the First World War, had instilled in him the belief that courage meant more than simply pulling a trigger. The Luftwaffe itself maintained certain unwritten rules, remnants of the chivalric traditions that had governed aerial combat in the previous war. Shooting a parachuting pilot was considered murder. Attacking unarmed hospital or rescue aircraft was forbidden, and destroying a defenseless enemy who clearly posed no threat was, in the eyes of some pilots, dishonorable. Yet the war had grown increasingly brutal by December 1943. The Allied bombing campaign was destroying German cities, killing thousands of civilians. The Eastern Front had devolved into barbarism. The stakes were existential for Germany. Every Allied bomber that reached home would return to drop more bombs on German women and children. Stigler could have justified the kill easily. This bomber had just attacked Bremen, likely killing German civilians. These Americans were enemies of the Reich. Orders were to destroy all enemy aircraft. His career advancement, his Knight's Cross, his reputation among his fellow pilots, all would be secured with one simple action: 4 seconds of gunfire. That's all it would take. His fingers tensed on the controls as he positioned his aircraft for the optimal firing angle, approaching from behind where the damaged tail offered no defensive fire. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the memory of his brother, August, killed in action on the Eastern Front. Perhaps it was the face of Lieutenant Rodel, his mentor, asking him what kind of man he wanted to be when the war ended. Or perhaps it was simply the recognition that, in this moment, he had the power to choose mercy in a world drowning in mercilessness. The winter wind screamed past Franz Stigler's canopy as he held formation with the crippled American bomber, his mind racing through calculations that had nothing to do with angles of attack or deflection shooting. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 responded to his slightest touch, a precision instrument of death that had served him faithfully through 3 years of aerial warfare. Yet now, in the moment when it should deliver his 28th victory, Stigler found himself frozen in a moral paralysis that defied his training, his orders, and his nation's expectations. Inside Ye Olde Pub, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown watched the German fighter with the fatalistic acceptance of a man who had already made peace with death. The bomber was barely controllable, wallowing through the air at 160 miles per hour, perilously close to stalling speed. The hydraulic system was destroyed, forcing Brown to muscle the controls with pure physical strength. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, had been struck by flak fragments and was in shock. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok, had been wounded in the leg. Sergeant Samuel Blackford, the top turret gunner, had exhausted his ammunition defending against earlier fighter attacks. Technical Sergeant Bertrand Coulomb worked frantically to tend the wounded while monitoring the failing engines. According to historical records preserved by the 8th Air Force Historical Society, Brown's bomber had been part of a massive raid involving 378 heavy bombers, targeting industrial facilities in Bremen and various targets of opportunity across northwestern Germany. The mission had been catastrophic for the American forces, with 27 bombers lost and hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Ye Olde Pub had absorbed damage that should have brought it down a dozen times over. The vertical stabilizer was nearly severed, flapping uselessly in the slipstream. The horizontal stabilizers were shredded. Holes large enough for a man to climb through perforated the wings and fuselage. Number 2 engine was completely dead, its propeller feathered. Number 4 engine ran roughly, threatening to fail at any moment. The electrical system was compromised, the oxygen system destroyed, the radio inoperable. Stigler could see all of this as he maintained formation with the bomber, close enough to make eye contact with the startled American crew members who stared at him through the gaping holes in their aircraft. The German pilot had every tactical advantage. The bomber couldn't defend itself, couldn't escape, couldn't even make evasive maneuvers without stalling and spinning into the earth. It was the equivalent of shooting a wounded animal lying helpless on the ground. Every fiber of Stigler's military training screamed at him to complete the mission. The Reich needed victories. His squadron expected kills. The civilians of Bremen, who had just endured another terror bombing, deserved vengeance. Yet Stiegler had fought alongside men who upheld a different standard. He remembered Gustav Rodel's farewell words before Stiegler left North Africa. "Honor is what you do when no one is watching." He thought of Hans Joachim Marseille, the legendary Star of Africa, who had once broken off an attack rather than shoot a defenseless enemy pilot. Marseille had been killed in September 1942, not by enemy fire, but by mechanical failure, and Stiegler had mourned him as both a mentor and a symbol of what a warrior could be: deadly yet honorable, skilled yet merciful when circumstances allowed. The German pilot made his choice in the span of perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity compressed into a heartbeat. He would not shoot the bomber. Instead, he would do something far more dangerous and inexplicable. Franz Stiegler eased his Messerschmitt closer to the battered B-17, pulling alongside the cockpit where Charles Brown sat wrestling with the controls of his dying aircraft. The German pilot made a deliberate gesture, rocking his wings and pointing westward toward the North Sea and freedom. Brown, his mind fogged by oxygen deprivation and exhaustion, couldn't comprehend what was happening. Was this some new German tactic? A sadistic game before the kill? The American pilot's training had never prepared him for this scenario. Enemy fighters attacked. They didn't escort. They didn't protect. They certainly didn't guide crippled bombers to safety, but that's exactly what Stiegler was doing. The Luftwaffe ace positioned his fighter as a shield between the bomber and the German anti-aircraft batteries that dotted the coastal defenses. As they approached the heavily defended coastal areas near Wilhelmshaven, Stiegler knew that German flak gunners would normally open fire on any aircraft in their range, friend or foe, to avoid being fooled by captured enemy planes. The standard procedure was brutal but effective. Shoot everything. Let the wreckage prove identity. However, the sight of a Messerschmitt flying formation with an American bomber created enough confusion to buy precious seconds. The flak gunners hesitated, uncertain whether this was a capture in progress, a navigation error, or something else entirely. Stiegler flew so close to the bomber that Brown could see the German pilot's face clearly. The Luftwaffe ace made repeated gestures, pointing toward Sweden, indicating that Brown should consider interning his crew there, rather than attempting the treacherous journey across the North Sea to England. Sweden maintained neutrality and would in turn Allied aircrews for the duration of the war, but at least they would survive. Brown shook his head stubbornly. He was going home, or dying in the attempt. England lay 150 miles across the frigid waters of the North Sea, where a water landing meant death by hypothermia within minutes. It was an insane gamble, but it was the only direction that led to American bases, to friendly territory, to any chance of continuing the fight. The historical account documented in military archives reveals that Stiegler escorted the American bomber for several minutes, flying through some of the most heavily defended airspace in occupied Europe. Every moment he flew with the enemy aircraft, he committed an act that could be construed as treason. The penalty for such actions was immediate court-martial and execution. Any German soldier on the ground who witnessed this incredible scene could report it. Any Luftwaffe pilot who happened upon them could shoot both aircraft down and claim Stiegler had been confused or compromised. The risk wasn't merely to his career, it was to his life and potentially to his family's safety in an increasingly paranoid Nazi state where suspicion of disloyalty could doom entire bloodlines. As they reached the coastline where the frozen beaches of northern Germany gave way to the steel-gray expanse of the North Sea, Stiegler made one final gesture. He saluted Brown, a formal military acknowledgement of respect between warriors, then peeled away, diving his Messerschmitt down toward the deck and heading back inland. According to Stiegler's own account given decades later, he waggled his wings one last time before disappearing into the clouds, a farewell that transcended the boundaries of nation, language, and war. Brown watched the German fighter vanish, his mind still struggling to process what had just occurred. Had he been spared out of mercy? Strategic calculation? A bizarre psychological warfare tactic? None of it made sense according to any military doctrine he'd studied. Ye Old Pub staggered out over the North Sea, its crew silent and stunned by their impossible survival. Brown coaxed every ounce of performance from the dying bomber, nursing the failing engines, maintaining altitude through sheer force of will. Behind him, the crew administered. The North Sea stretched before them like an endless gray void, its frigid waters churning with whitecaps that promised instant death should they be forced to ditch. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown kept the bomber at an altitude of barely 500 feet, too low for German radar to track effectively, but high enough that a sudden mechanical failure wouldn't immediately send them into the sea. Every minute that passed felt like a gift, each mile closer to England, a miracle compounding upon miracles. The crew remained at battle stations not because they expected further combat, but because sitting down meant confronting the reality of what they had just survived and the impossibility of what lay ahead. Technical Sergeant Bertrand Coulombe worked his way through the aircraft, assessing damage that defied comprehension. The tail section was attached by what seemed little more than hope and rivets. Hydraulic fluid mixed with blood on the deck. Oxygen bottles had been punctured by shell fragments. The electrical system sparked intermittently. One wing had a hole large enough that Coulombe could see completely through it to the ocean below. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Richard Pechout, attempted repeatedly to establish communication with English bases, but the radio equipment was too damaged. They were flying blind, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, hoping that Brown's navigation calculations were accurate, and that the English Channel winds wouldn't push them off course into the vast Atlantic. The wounded required constant attention. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, had regained consciousness, but remained disoriented from his head injury. Staff Sergeant Alex Yelisanko, the right waist gunner, had suffered shrapnel wounds to his legs. Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, the co-pilot, fought through shock and pain to assist Brown with the controls when the pilot's muscles began to fail from exhaustion. They shared chocolate bars from emergency rations, the sugar providing momentary energy. They spoke little, conserving strength, each man alone with thoughts of home, of family, of the incomprehensible mercy they had received from an enemy who should have killed them without hesitation. According to records maintained by the Royal Air Force Seething Airfield Museum, where Ye Olde Pub eventually landed, the bomber appeared on British radar as an unidentified aircraft approaching from the east at extremely low altitude. Fighter controllers scrambled Spitfires to intercept what they assumed was a German reconnaissance aircraft or a confused Luftwaffe pilot attempting to defect. The Spitfire pilots who intercepted the bomber reported being shocked by its condition. One pilot radioed that he couldn't understand how the aircraft was still airborne, that it looked like a flying piece of Swiss cheese. The British fighters escorted Ye Olde Pub to the emergency airfield at Seething in Norfolk, where crash equipment and ambulances stood ready. Brown brought the bomber in for an approach that tested every hour of his flight training. Without hydraulics, he couldn't lower the landing gear normally and was forced to use the emergency hand crank system. The crew took positions for crash landing, bracing themselves against bulkheads. The co-pilot called out airspeed while Brown fought the controls, the aircraft responding sluggishly to every input. The runway at Seething appeared through the mist, a strip of concrete that represented salvation. Brown dropped the bomber toward the threshold, fighting to maintain the precise angle and speed that would put them down without stalling or overshooting. The tires shrieked against the runway at approximately 1500 hours local time. One tire immediately blew from the impact. The bomber veered slightly, but Brown corrected, standing on the brakes, the aircraft shuddering as it decelerated. When Ye Olde Pub finally rolled to a stop at the end of the runway, emergency crews swarmed the aircraft. Medics climbed through the holes in the fuselage to reach the wounded. Ground crew personnel stood in stunned silence, examining the damage, counting the holes, over 250 of them according to the maintenance reports. The aircraft was declared beyond repair and would never fly again. Charles Brown and his crew were debriefed by intelligence officers who recorded their statements with a mixture of professional detachment and private disbelief. When Brown recounted the story of the German fighter pilot who had spared them, escorted them to safety, and saluted before departing, the intelligence officers exchanged skeptical glances. Psychological stress, oxygen deprivation, shock, all could produce hallucinations and false memories. The official report noted the incident, but with obvious doubt. In the brutal arithmetic of the Second World War, where daily death counts climbed into thousands, the story of one merciful enemy seemed almost fantastical, a fairy tale that had no place in official military records. Brown himself struggled with what had happened. He lay in his barracks that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of the encounter. Why had the German pilot spared them? The question gnawed at him with an intensity that exceeded even his relief at surviving. He had lost friends in the air war, good men who had been shot down, who had burned in their aircraft, who had frozen to death in the North Sea. Why had he and his crew been chosen for mercy when so many others had died? Was there something he should have done differently? Should he have attempted to reach Sweden as the German pilot had suggested? The weight of survivor's guilt settled over him like a heavy blanket, made heavier by the knowledge that his salvation had come from the hand of an enemy who, by all rights, should have killed him without a second thought. The crew was granted leave before reassignment. Some men never spoke of the incident again, burying it beneath layers of protective silence. Others told the story to family members who listened politely, but couldn't truly comprehend the magnitude of what had occurred. How could civilians understand the brutal logic of aerial combat, the instant judgments of life and death, or the profound significance of one man choosing mercy in a war that demanded mercilessness? Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode recovered from his wounds, but carried the physical scars for the rest of his life. Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok returned to combat missions, but never again felt the invincibility that young men often bring to war. The experience had revealed the fundamental randomness of survival, the thin line between life and death that could pivot on a single decision by a stranger. Franz Stiegler, meanwhile, landed his Messerschmitt at Yever Airfield and filed a routine after-action report that made no mention of the encounter with the American bomber. According to later interviews documented in Adam Makos's extensively researched book, A Higher Call, Stiegler told no one about what he had done, not his commanding officer, not his fellow pilots, not even his closest friends. The German pilot understood instinctively that his act of mercy would be viewed as betrayal, perhaps even treason, by a Nazi regime that demanded absolute commitment to the destruction of the enemy. He had forfeited his 28th kill, the victory that would have earned him the Knight's Cross and significant advancement in rank and prestige. He had risked his life and career to save men who had just bombed German cities, potentially killing his own countrymen. More than that, Stiegler carried the burden of knowing that his choice had been fundamentally irrational from a military perspective. The bomber he spared would be repaired, or its crew would fly other missions. The Americans he saved would return to drop more bombs on Germany. By showing mercy, he had arguably contributed to the deaths of future German soldiers and civilians. Yet he never regretted his decision. In the years that followed, as Germany spiraled toward defeat and the full horror of the Nazi regime became apparent, Stiegler would look back on that December day as the moment when he had remained human in an increasingly inhuman war. He had chosen to be a warrior rather than a murderer, to uphold a code that transcended national loyalty. The war continued with its relentless momentum, grinding millions of lives into dust, reshaping continents, destroying empires and ideologies. The war ended in May 1945 with Germany's unconditional surrender, leaving Europe in ruins and the world forever changed. Charles Brown returned to the United States, resuming a civilian life that never quite fit the man who had emerged from the crucible of combat. He completed his education, married, started a family, and built a career. But the memory of that December day over Germany remained vivid and inexplicable. In quiet moments, he would find himself wondering about the German pilot who had spared his life, who he was, whether he had survived the war, what had motivated his extraordinary act of mercy. Brown occasionally mentioned the incident to other veterans, but most dismissed it as embellishment or misremembering. The narrative of the Second World War had been written in stark terms of good versus evil, heroism versus atrocity, with little room for nuance or stories that complicated the moral certainties that victorious nations preferred. Franz Stiegler survived the war, though his story took a dramatically different path. He continued flying combat missions through the final years of the conflict, eventually accumulating 28 confirmed victories. He was awarded the Knight's Cross in March 1944 for his cumulative service, though the citation made no mention of any American bomber. As Germany collapsed in 1945, Stigler found himself among the millions of defeated German soldiers facing an uncertain future in a nation that had been utterly destroyed. According to historical records, he emigrated to Canada in 1953, settling in Vancouver and working as a businessman, deliberately leaving his past as a Luftwaffe ace behind him. Like many German veterans, he rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, carrying the memories as private burdens that the wider world had no interest in understanding. For 46 years, the two men lived separate lives on separate continents, unaware of each other's fates. Brown built a successful career in the United States Foreign Service, eventually retiring to Florida. Stigler established himself in Canadian business circles, raising a family and building a life far removed from the violence that had once defined his existence. Both men aged, watched their children grow, witnessed the world transform through the Cold War, the space age, the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s. The Second World War receded into history, becoming something that younger generations studied in textbooks rather than lived through, its personal stories fading as veterans died and memories dimmed. But Charles Brown never forgot. The question of the German pilot's identity haunted him with increasing intensity as he aged. In 1986, more than 4 decades after the incident, Brown attended a reunion of the 8th Air Force Bomber Command. Encouraged by his wife, who had heard the story countless times and believed it deserved resolution, Brown placed an advertisement in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots. The notice was simple and direct. He was seeking a German pilot who, on December 20, 1943, had spared a damaged B-17 bomber over northern Germany. Brown included what details he could remember: the type of aircraft, the approximate location, the German pilot's gestures and actions. The response came months later in January 1990, a letter postmarked from Vancouver, Canada. Franz Stigler had seen the advertisement and immediately recognized the incident Brown described. The German pilot had never forgotten that day either, though for different reasons. Where Brown had been haunted by questions of why he had been spared, Stigler had been haunted by the certainty that he would die, without ever knowing whether his act of mercy had mattered, whether the crew he saved had actually survived the journey home. The two men began corresponding, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth as they shared their perspectives on that extraordinary encounter. They exchanged photographs showing themselves as they were now, white-haired, elderly, wearing the faces of grandfathers rather than warriors. They compared memories, filling in gaps that neither had understood during the event itself. In 1990, Charles Brown and Franz Stigler met face-to-face for the first time since December 20, 1943, when they had been mortal enemies separated by a cockpit canopy and the width of history. The meeting took place at a hotel in Seattle, arranged by the daughter of another veteran who had facilitated their correspondence. According to witnesses present that day, including Brown's wife and Stigler's family members, the moment the two elderly men saw each other was charged with an emotion that transcended simple reunion. They embraced as brothers, tears streaming down weathered faces, speaking in broken phrases that conveyed more than complete sentences ever could. Here were two men who had shared the most significant moment of their respective lives, separated by decades and distance, finally given the opportunity to acknowledge that the event had been real, that it mattered, that it meant something beyond the cold statistics of military history. Over the following years, Brown and Stigler developed a deep friendship that defied all conventional understanding. They visited each other regularly, attended military reunions together, and gave joint interviews to historians interested in their story. Stigler finally explained his decision to spare the bomber, describing the influence of his mentor Gustav Rödel and his belief that honor meant maintaining humanity even in the midst of war's dehumanization. Brown expressed his gratitude not simply for his own life being spared, but for what Stigler's action represented. Proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, individual conscience could prevail over tribal hatred. The former enemies became symbols of reconciliation, demonstrating that the bonds formed through shared experience could transcend national identity, ideology, or the artificial divisions that nations create to justify conflict. Their story eventually reached a wider audience through the book A Higher Call, published in 2012 by Adam Makos and Larry Alexander. The extensively researched account provided comprehensive documentation of the incident, including military records, personal interviews, and corroborating testimony from surviving crew members and Luftwaffe personnel. The book became a bestseller, introducing new generations to a story that challenged simplistic narratives about the Second World War. Readers were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that the enemy was not a monolithic evil, but a collection of individuals capable of both terrible cruelty and extraordinary mercy. The story raised profound questions about the nature of duty, the limits of obedience, and the possibilities for human decency, even within institutional evil. Franz Stiegler died in March 2008 at the age of 92 in Vancouver, having lived long enough to see his act of mercy recognized and celebrated rather than condemned as treason. Charles Brown preceded him in death by just 8 months, passing away in November 2007 in Florida at the age of 87. In a coincidence that seemed almost scripted by fate, the two men who had been bound together by one extraordinary moment in December 1943 died within months of each other, their friendship lasting until the end. They were buried thousands of miles apart, yet their stories remain forever intertwined. The legacy of their encounter continues to resonate in an era when tribal divisions, nationalism, and dehumanization of enemies remain persistent threats to global peace. The story of German ace Franz Stiegler and American bomber pilot Charles Brown serves as a reminder that in every conflict, in every moment of crisis, individuals retain the power to choose mercy over vengeance, humanity over ideology, and honor over expedience. That single act on December 20th, 1943, a German pilot's decision not to pull the trigger, saved 9 American lives directly and created a narrative that has influenced countless others. It stands as testament to the possibility that even in war's darkest moments, the light of human conscience can pierce through, offering hope that our better angels might still prevail over our worst impulses. The Messerschmitt and the B-17 have long since been reduced to scrap metal or museum pieces, but the moral courage displayed in the sky over northern Germany endures, challenging each new generation to consider what they would do when faced with the choice between the easy path of hatred and the harder road of mercy.